I had an idea to do a series of portraits based on American poets. This was back in 2016. And I naturally started with Walt Whitman. And I painted him in alizarin blue mixed with a little white. And when I looked at it, I thought, oh my God, this is a terrible mistake. I hate this. No one wants to see Walt Whitman in blue jewel tones. I wanted something that equated with his greatest work of writing, one of the greatest works in American literature, Leaves of Grass. So it was natural to paint him in green. But it turns out that Walt Whitman was a relatively well-documented person throughout his life. So there were a lot of portraits to choose from. And I thought the Matthew Brady portrait was really one that reflected the Walt Whitman, who was this great romantic revolutionary in American poetry and really started modern writing in America. I've always been interested in portraiture. Even as a child, the first thing I can remember in my life related to art was seeing an episode on Leonardo da Vinci on Captain Kangaroo. And I was just fascinated by his portraits and his notebooks and the implements of war and the equestrian statues. But the portraits were really what got me. And so with Faded Hoodie, I wanted this large self-portrait of myself. And like many of my inspirations, they come to me first thing in the morning. I jumped up from the breakfast table and told my wife I had an idea for a painting. I was going to wear this faded sweatshirt that I wore to do all my painting in and my gessoing in which 7 years later I still wear. It's much more faded and much more splotched with gesso, as you can imagine, over that time. But in any case, we went to the studio without having any preparations beforehand. I hadn't combed my hair, I hadn't changed out of my clothes that I slept in, tossed on the Faded Hoodie, and I had my wife do this portrait of me. Unlike most of my models that I torture with 300 or 500 images in order to find just one to paint, I made my wife stop after 50 or 75 and said, that's it, we've got it. And what you see here is the result. It's a combination of largely two bodies of work, biographies, which is a series of paintings based on friends and neighbors, and Lit, which is a larger body of work, 17 paintings, which is based on my creative heroes and inspirations from my undergraduate days that really address the ideas of literary fame and history, and also inspired me as a young man. Some of the figures, like Emily Dickinson, for instance, was only photographed once in her life that we're aware of. The painting that I chose to create my work from was not even a painting. I found out, much to my surprise, was really a drawing that was commissioned by her sister. And it looked like a daguerreotype from that time, which fooled me. And when I finished the work, to my surprise, it didn't come out as realistic as I had intended it to be. It really looks more like an ethereal presence or a spiritual presence. As I began to read them, each of them reached me in a different way. For instance, Joseph Conrad, whom I was not very familiar with, his great book, I think is Lord Jim. And it's the story of a man who is trying to evade his truth. Really related to that story of redemption and understanding and trying to find who you are. And then other figures in here in my lit series also contributed to my understanding, my emotional intelligence, if you will, or awareness, like Toni Morrison, for instance. I'd long wanted to read her, and when I finally did, I was just bowled over by the beauty and intensity of her language and her evocation of slavery and race relations. And I wanted us to connect with her and see the intensity that she has, and also feel the intense psychology and despair, and also creativity beneath the surface of her portrait. I'd already painted Thomas Hardy, whom I was very attracted to. I love his books. They're so dark and violent and bloody, and are such in-depth psychological portraits. And I painted him in black and white, trying to get something really very realistic, and then slathered him with red to accentuate the bloody nature of the works I thought he created for us. All of these subjects, I relate to them in different ways. A friend of mine described 100 Years Solitude as a poem of a book. And I think that's the truest description of his writing I've ever heard. And so it's very moving, his work is very exciting, and his work, I think, of all the people I painted, most relates to my upbringing in rural western Craighead County, where there are just these myths that abound. The way we know people or way we remember events is through this received bounty of stories that were handed down from my grandmother, in my case, who lived just down the road for me, or people that I grew up with repeating the same stories over and over again. So they become larger in life. These paintings that are called the biographies are really an outgrowth of Maya Angelou and Mark Strand that you see that are on a stark background. And I began thinking about the intensity of portraits and even thinking more personally about people. And these paintings are comprised of my neighbors, people down the street, people that I've encountered or met in Fayetteville, and even a few relatives. In my paintings, what you can see is the pencil marks of the drawings underneath, much like a palimpsest that was very much part of 19th century art, where they began to look at the figures underneath ancient paintings. So there are a lot of smudged edges. There are a lot of unpainted areas. Their clothing is barely hinted at. They're very sketchy. And all of this is done to really focus the attention on the faces of these subjects. One of the first paintings that I did in this group was Jeffrey Davis. He's an award-winning, nationally renowned poet who lives in Fayetteville. And I was just knocked out by his poetry. If you've read any of it, it's really the closest thing I've ever seen to prayer. It's very intimate, it's very close, it's very gentle, it's very moving. Most people will never ever see these people in their lives, but I hope that through the detail in the paintings, you'll recognize them as human, you'll make a connection with them, and in doing that realize that you and they and we are all part of the same era, the same region, and the same world, and we're all connected.